Welcome to Compact Disasters from compacthistories.com, where we look at catastrophes, accidents, and natural disasters in short, bite-sized episodes. Before we start, a quick announcement. A brand new podcast is joining the Compact Histories family. It's called Compact Science, and it brings you clear, straightforward explanations of science-related topics, all in the same short, bite-sized format. Look out for Compact Science wherever you get your podcasts and on compacthistories.com, launching in the next couple of weeks. With that being said, let's get back to the show. This is episode 75, The Vargas Tragedy. In December 1999, the part of Venezuela hit hardest by what became known as the Vargas Tragedy was a narrow coastal strip north of Caracas, squeezed between the Caribbean Sea and the steep northern slopes of the Cordillera de la Costa. It was a place of great beauty, with beaches, port towns, hotels, homes and busy roads, pressed onto the little flat land available between mountain and water. That geography made the region attractive for settlement, but it also made it dangerously exposed. The same mountain valleys that gave access to the coast also acted as natural channels for water, rock and mud when heavy rain arrived. Researchers from the United States Geological Survey, USGS, later noted that many communities had been built on alluvial fans, broad deposits left behind by earlier floods and debris flows, which meant people were living on ground shaped by past disasters. By 1999, several 100,000 people were living along this coastal corridor in Vargas State, in towns such as La Guaira, Maiquetía, and Macuto. The area was economically important because it included the port serving Caracas and Simón Bolívar International Airport, the country's main international gateway. It was also heavily developed, far more so than it had been in earlier decades. That mattered because the region had a known history of destructive flooding and landslides. Similar events had struck in 1951, but years of population growth and construction had placed far more people, roads and buildings directly in harm's way by the end of the 20th century. In other words, the disaster of 1999 was not waiting to happen because rain alone was dangerous. It was waiting because extreme weather would be hitting a landscape where vulnerability had been built into daily life. This is what makes the opening of the Vargas story so important. Before the dead, before the mud, before the terrible images of homes smashed and swept into the sea, there was a coastal region living with a hidden weakness. The mountains behind it were steep, unstable and cut by ravines. The communities below were dense, exposed and hemmed in, with very little room to retreat once nature turned violent. To holidaymakers and residents, it looked like paradise beneath the mountains. To a geologist, it looked like a warning label written across the land itself, just waiting for the sky to open. By the start of December 1999, the ground in Vargas State was already being primed for disaster. This was not a case of one sudden downpour arriving out of nowhere. According to USGS research, the first 2 weeks of the month had already brought 293 millimeters of rain to the Maiquetía area, more than 5 times the usual amount for that period. Then came the far more dangerous phase. Between the 14th and 16th of December, an additional 911 millimeters fell in just 52 hours. An astonishing total for a region where the annual average was about 523 millimeters. In effect, the coast received far more than a year's normal rainfall in a matter of days. The timing made the event even stranger. Coastal Venezuela's rainy season usually runs from May to October, not deep into December. USGS investigators linked the weather pattern to the interaction of a cold front with moist southwesterly flow, moving from the Pacific towards the Caribbean. That combination created an unusually wet spell over northern Venezuela, at a time of year when people were not expecting a disaster of this scale. It meant that what should have felt like the approach to Christmas instead became a slow tightening of the screws, with rain soaking hillsides, filling channels, and quietly increasing the strain on the landscape above the coastal towns. At first, the rain was dangerous, mostly in the abstract. Roads were wet, rivers were rising, and people could see the weather was unusually bad, but the full implications were not yet obvious. That is often how disasters gather strength. The early phase looks inconvenient, even miserable, rather than apocalyptic. Yet every hour of rainfall was loading more water into thin soils on steep slopes and into the narrow ravines that cut through the mountains. Those ravines drained directly towards densely populated areas below. In geological terms, the system was charging itself. By the time the worst weather arrived, the hillsides were saturated and increasingly unstable. December 16th became the crucial day. The most severe destruction came then, after especially heavy rain through the previous day and evening. One recorded hourly burst in the morning measured 72 millimeters in just 1 hour at Maiquetía, the kind of intensity that can turn steep channels into violent torrents with almost no warning. In higher elevations, rainfall may have been even greater than at the coast, and all that water had to go somewhere. So it rushed downslope, dragging sediment, rock, trees and debris with it into the settlements below. The Vargas story is not simply about bad weather. It is about accumulation, saturation, and mounting instability. The danger grew in layers. First the unusually wet early month, then the extreme multi-day storm, then the bursts of intense rainfall that pushed the landscape past its limit. By the time many residents understood that this was more than a regular storm, the mountains above them were already preparing to move. By the evening of the 15th of December, 1999, the long build-up of rain in Vargas State crossed the line from danger to catastrophe. Water that had been soaking into the mountains above the coast now began rushing through narrow channels towards the Caribbean, and the slopes themselves started to fail. USGS researchers found that thousands of shallow landslides were triggered across the northern face of the Cordillera de la Costa. These were not isolated slips on a few unstable hillsides. They were widespread failures across an already saturated mountain system, stripping away soil, rock, and vegetation, and sending that material down towards the towns built below on the alluvial fans. Eyewitness reports placed the first debris flows at around 8:30 in the evening on the 15th of December. That timing is important because it meant many people were caught in darkness, with heavy rain still falling and visibility already poor. The flows were not simply muddy water. They were dense, fast-moving mixtures of water, boulders, tree trunks, broken masonry, and earth. As runoff surged down from the mountains, it mixed with the landslide material and transformed into something far more destructive than a flood alone. USGS accounts note that many catchments released multiple debris flows over the course of the night, meaning the danger did not come as one single blow, but as repeated assaults from the slopes above. Once those flows reached the built-up coastal strip, the geography of Vargas turned against its residents with brutal efficiency. The alluvial fans, normally the only buildable flat ground between the mountains and the sea, became the pathways along which debris spread into communities. In places, the flows abandoned their natural channels and spilled directly into the streets, cutting new routes through neighborhoods and smashing through whatever stood in the way. USGS investigators reported that overbank flows demolished 2-story houses and even destroyed the lower floors of apartment buildings. These were not minor inundations, leaving mud in the ground floor hallway. In some areas, whole structures were battered apart or swept away. The violence of the event can be measured not only in the destruction left behind, but in the physical force of the flows themselves. Geologists studying the deposits later estimated velocities of several meters per second, fast enough to give people little or no chance to escape once the debris was upon them. Massive boulders were carried down onto the fan deltas, and the floodwaters continued into the following morning. A second wave, beginning around 7 to 9 a.m. on the 16th of December, and lasting into the afternoon, was less concentrated with sediment but still powerfully destructive, cutting fresh channels into the deposits laid down during the night and dragging new debris across the same shattered terrain. The worst destruction, therefore, happened on the 16th of December, after especially heavy rain through the previous day and evening. Along roughly 100 kilometers of coastline, communities were devastated. Later reports described entire settlements, such as Carmen de Uria and Cerro Grande, as having effectively disappeared, while neighborhoods like Los Corrales were buried under meters of mud. This is why the Vargas tragedy stands apart, even among major landslide disasters. It was not only the scale of rainfall or even the number of slides, but the way a whole mountainside seemed to come apart above a crowded coastal corridor. By the time daylight fully revealed what had happened, parts of Vargas no longer looked damaged. They had been effectively erased. When daylight came after the worst of the debris flows, the scale of human destruction in Vargas State became painfully clear. This was no longer just a story of rainfall records, unstable slopes, or geological processes. It was now a human catastrophe measured in missing relatives, shattered homes, blocked roads, and entire neighborhoods turned into fields of mud, rock, and broken concrete. Along the narrow coastal strip north of Caracas, families emerged into landscapes they barely recognized. Streets had vanished. Buildings had been split apart or buried to their roofs. In some places, the ground itself seemed to have been rearranged overnight. One of the most haunting features of the Vargas tragedy is that the true death toll has never been firmly established. Estimates have ranged widely, from roughly 10,000 to as high as 30,000 people killed. Other sources have offered lower official counts, but the chaos of the event, the number of people swept into the sea, and the complete destruction of some communities made certainty almost impossible. Many bodies were never recovered. Many people were simply listed as missing and never seen again. In disaster history, that uncertainty often tells its own grim story. It usually means the destruction was so extensive that even counting the dead became part of the tragedy. The physical losses were staggering. Tens of thousands of homes were destroyed, and many more were damaged beyond repair. Key infrastructure was hit as well. Roads along the coast were torn apart or buried, isolating towns from one another and making rescue far more difficult. The region's port and airport links were badly affected, cutting into the movement of supplies and emergency personnel at the very moment they were most needed. Water systems, electricity networks, and communication lines were also disrupted, leaving survivors trapped not only by the debris around them, but by the collapse of the systems that normally held everyday life together. Entire communities suffered differently, depending on where they sat on the fan deltas and drainage channels. Some neighborhoods were partly flooded and buried, others were effectively wiped from the map. Reports describe places such as Carmen de Uria being devastated so completely that large parts of the settlement ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Survivors were left clinging to rooftops, stranded on isolated patches of higher ground, or wandering through wreckage trying to locate relatives and neighbors. What had been familiar coastal towns only a day earlier became landscapes of confusion and grief. The wider social impact was immense. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected, and many were displaced, some permanently. Homes, businesses, schools, and community networks disappeared together. The mountain had moved, the water had rushed through, and thousands of people realized they had no home to return to, no street to rebuild, and in far too many cases, no certainty at all about who had survived. In the immediate aftermath of the Vargas tragedy, rescue was made brutally difficult by the same geography that had made the disaster so deadly in the first place. The narrow coastal corridor was served mainly by a single highway, and the USGS later identified the lack of sufficient evacuation routes as a major problem. Once debris flows, flooding and landslides tore across the state, that road was extensively blocked, isolating communities from one another and cutting survivors off from fast overland help. In many places, bridges, roads, electricity, telephone lines and water systems were either damaged or completely lost, which meant rescuers were working in an environment where transport, communication and basic coordination had partly collapsed. That left emergency workers to improvise. Relief reports from late December 1999 described people being brought out by helicopter, boat and bus, depending on where they were stranded and what routes still existed. Some survivors were lifted from isolated coastal areas, others were gathered from beaches, and many were moved towards Caracas or temporary shelters elsewhere. This was not a neat, orderly evacuation. It was a scramble across wrecked terrain, with rescuers trying to reach people who often had no food, little clean water, and no clear idea where family members had gone. Some survivors arrived in Caracas without knowing whether relatives were alive, dead, or stranded somewhere else along the shattered coast. The scale of displacement quickly became enormous. An estimated 190,000 people were evacuated. Relief agencies, however, also noted how hard it was to establish exact figures because people were constantly moving between shelters, relatives' homes, temporary accommodation, and other parts of the country. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, noted that the number of evacuees and internally displaced people was difficult to pin down for precisely that reason. In other words, even once people escaped the mud, the crisis did not become simple. Survival gave way to uncertainty, and uncertainty gave way to a huge humanitarian burden. Aid came from within Venezuela and from abroad. The immediate priority was saving survivors and providing emergency shelter, medical care, food and water. The response also became politically charged, but on the ground, the first days were about basic human needs, getting people out, treating the injured, and trying to stabilize communities that had effectively ceased to function. Shelters filled rapidly, and some accounts described thousands of people packed into temporary accommodation while authorities struggled to organize supplies and registration. By now, the mud had stopped moving, but chaos had not. For survivors, the next ordeal was not the mountainside coming down. It was the long, disorienting reality of trying to stay alive in the ruins that remained. The legacy of the Vargas tragedy lies not only in the number of people killed, displaced, or left missing, but in what the disaster revealed about the relationship between landscape, planning, and memory. In December 1999, a rare but not unprecedented combination of extreme rainfall and unstable mountain terrain produced one of the deadliest disasters in modern Latin American history. Yet the catastrophe was not caused by weather alone. Later analysis by the US Geological Survey made clear that many homes and neighborhoods had been built on alluvial fans and debris flow deposits laid down by earlier events. In plain terms, large numbers of people were living on land that had already been shaped by destructive flooding and landslides in the past. The 1999 tragedy was therefore both a natural disaster and a planning disaster, one in which geological history had been ignored or underestimated until it returned with devastating force. That is one reason Vargas still matters. It became a case study in how vulnerability accumulates over time. Population growth, expanding construction, inadequate drainage, and limited escape routes all increased the scale of the losses when the storm came. USGS investigators pointed to the region's lack of evacuation options as a serious factor in the death toll, and the broader pattern is now familiar in disaster studies around the world. Heavy rain becomes a catastrophe when people, infrastructure, and assumptions are placed in the path of known hazards. Vargas was not simply struck by nature. It had, over decades, placed itself in nature's firing line. The disaster also left a permanent mark on Venezuela's national consciousness. Entire communities were erased or transformed. Families were separated forever, sometimes without even the certainty of burial or official confirmation. The number of dead remains disputed, with estimates ranging widely, and that uncertainty has itself become part of the story. Disasters are often remembered through monuments, anniversaries, and official numbers. But Vargas is also remembered through absence, through missing names, missing homes, and missing streets. In some locations, the physical geography of the coast was altered so severely that the pre-disaster landscape effectively disappeared. This was not just a tragedy people survived, it was one that changed the map. Today, the Vargas tragedy remains sharply relevant. Around the world, more people continue to settle in hazard-prone zones, whether on floodplains, unstable hillsides, wildfire corridors, or vulnerable coasts. Climate variability and extreme weather only sharpen that risk. The Vargas tragedy stands as a warning that disasters are rarely natural in the simple sense. Rain falls, rivers rise, slopes fail, but catastrophe is shaped by where people build, what they ignore, and how prepared they are when warning signs appear. That is why Vargas still matters in the history of disaster. It was not only a terrible event in Venezuela in December 1999. It was a brutal lesson in what happens when geography, weather, and human vulnerability collide, and a lesson the modern world still has not fully learned. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Disasters, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactdisasters.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, true crime, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/disasterscoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.